There is not a lot that is consistent in community media nowadays. Local print outlets come and go. Mostly they go, as do blogs and even podcasts and other incarnations of new media that we come to adore and rely on. That's all incredibly unfortunate as far as our team is concerned, since, as anybody who watches this show or follows the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism knows, community news is incredibly important and is often the only thing keeping bad people in check and giving good people the pat on the back they deserve. This show, now in motion for well over a year, is a case in point in the latter especially. Since starting up, we've featured and interviewed dozens of activists, people involved with battles over everything from immigration to bike safety, and many of whom do not always get a chance to voice their ideas and opinions. We're proud of that, and we plan on continuing down that route. With that said, I want to note a small change in our operation, at least for the time being. Up to this point, Beyond Boston has more or less focused each episode around a single topic. In addition to the aforementioned issues, we've tackled cannabis reform, transportation, housing, ballot questions, electoral politics, and the list goes on. But from this day forward, we'll do our best to represent the wonderfully vast cornucopia of stories that our friends at community access stations yield month after month, and we'll do it all in each episode. For those who are just now checking the show out, our mission is to show that stories from one community don't magically end at an arbitrary border. Cambridge bike issues, for example, are inherently linked to cycle infrastructure in Brookline, Boston, and Somerville. Similarly, the housing crunch in Metro Boston can be linked to comparable and intersecting topics all across the region. Naturally, almost everything we cover, and that we include from our partner stations, also connects to the larger country and planet around us. That goes for obvious themes, like when we featured clips from local women's marches last year that coordinated with a larger movement in the Capitol, but also in other ways. This month, for example, we're featuring a package from our friends at Brookline Interactive Group, who explored the renaming of a school that was formerly named for a slave owner. Sorry if I covered lots of ground here, but what I am trying to say is that somehow, against a lot of odds, the ragtag team here at Beyond Boston is still kicking. And we don't just keep on ticking, but in a lot of ways, we keep on getting better. In case you missed it, for our last episode, we even hosted a live taping of our public talk about net neutrality, featuring Congressman Mike Capuano and a number of other esteemed guests. Now, without further ado, let's get into that aforementioned clip from Big in Brookline, as well as one from Somerville Neighborhood Network about seniors taking action on the healthcare front.
Brookline residents and officials are currently debating whether the town should rename the Devotion School, one of Brookline's largest K-8 schools. The school is currently named after Edward Devotion, a slaveholder who donated land to the town where the school was later built more than 100 years following his death. Brookline's debate reflects a nationwide conversation about racism and facing our history of slavery. Brookline residents Deborah Brown and Ann Greenwald filed a warrant article for the May 2018 town meeting proposing that the school's name be changed.
Devotion's name started with slavery, and to keep that name today says something very sad, very horrible about this. I think changing the name, it's almost like a form of restorative justice. It is a tangible, it is a real act that says a lot about this community, but also how people should perceive of themselves as members of this community. We want a safe place for all children to go to school with honor and dignity. We don't want an institution that sanctions racism.
We owe it to our children to have integrity and consistency in demonstrating our values in our actions.
In the months leading up to the town meeting, members of Brookline School Committee and a newly formed ad hoc task force have been meeting to discuss and further investigate this issue. Residents on all sides have been showing up to the public meetings to voice their opinions and concerns.
This is an opportunity to make a positive step towards racial justice in Brookline and be the town that we say we are.
We should use every tool in our toolbox to remedy the wrongs of the nation's past, address the legacy of discrimination, become aware of the unconscious myths that still inform us.
Does Brookline value tradition over justice? What does that say about the town?
Completely against erasing history, but I do not believe that remembering history requires honoring.
if Hitler walked in here with like $100,000 and was like, I got your land, would you name something after that guy?
Some members of the public have expressed mixed feelings about the issue, while others have taken a strong position against the renaming.
I'm still conflicted because I don't want to forget. You know, I don't want to not have that reminder that we have this part of our history, and it's important to face that history and to know that we are absolutely an imperfect town.
It's about the individual. It's not about what people did back then. It's about the individual. The individual was good. He gave money to the town. We don't know how he treated a slave, but the assumption is if he's an upstanding person, he probably, most likely, he did right by a slave. People who gave significant value to the town, we put a name on it.
The process for changing Devotion's name could be a lengthy one. Brookline's bylaws give town meeting the power to name public facilities. Additionally, a naming committee is responsible for recommending names for Brookline's public facilities. Leading up to town meeting, the school committee would make a recommendation to the naming committee based on what would ideally be a collaborative community process to select a new name. If the town determines that the name should be changed at the 2018 meeting, it could take several months for a new name to be selected and approved in accordance with the town's naming criteria. We spoke with David Pollock, Brookline's school committee chair, to gain more insight into this process.
Everybody on the school committee is pleased that we've put together the ad hoc task force with, it's really a very powerful group of citizens who are historians, who are, sort of a broad spectrum of representation of our community, that this task force is going to look into this question more deeply, look into the history more deeply, and then bring back to us their what they find. The first question before us is really, should we reopen the school at 345 Harvard Street as the Edward Devotion School, or should it have a different name? And I think the school committee feels that we should answer that question first and separately. And then once we've decided whether the name continues to be appropriate or we decide that it isn't and we need a different name, then we'll go on to figure out how to best find a name. So I think people are very excited about being an inclusionary process. I think people are very excited about including students in the process. I think the right next steps are to, if it is ultimately the decision of town meeting that the name should change, then to have a real community process and find a name that Brookline can really rally around and embrace and feel good about as an identity for our kids and for our community. It's really important.
At Brookline's annual town meeting held in May 2018, warrant article number 23, which deals with the renaming issue of Devotion School, will be addressed. For Brookline Interactive Group, this is Shannon Ortali.
It's really good that we can talk about these numbers in a large sense, because that's what helped us move the bill. But in reality, it's the personal sense. It's what it means in the lives of our friends and our neighbors that makes this so important that we pass.
On Friday, April 20th, Massachusetts Senior Action Council held a meeting in St. Joseph's Church to talk to residents about their proposed Bridge the Gap healthcare bill.
From what we understand, in total there would be something like 70,000 people in the state who are now living on those margins who would be able to benefit from this program.
The goal of the bill is to improve health care for those over the age of 65 in Massachusetts and would change three main things. First, for Medicare savings programs, the bill would increase the income eligibility for those over the age of 65 to 300% of the federal poverty line to match the eligibility for those under 65, and would eliminate the asset test. Second, for Mass Health, it would raise the income eligibility to 138% of the federal poverty line, again to match the eligibility for those under 65, and raises the asset limit to match the federal limit used by the Low Income Subsidy Program administered by the Social Security Administration. Currently, the Massachusetts asset limit is $2,000 for an individual, while the federal limit is $8,780. Lastly, the bill would simplify the application process for both Medicare savings programs and Mass Health to make it easier for seniors to get assistance. At the meeting, several Somerville residents spoke about their experiences with healthcare as they aged and how this bill would help them.
I'm paying $413.40 for access to healthcare, and my rent is only $299 a month rent. So you can see I'm paying more for healthcare than I am for housing, and the only reason I'm not homeless is because I was accepted into disabled elderly housing in 1998, which if I didn't have today, I would definitely be homeless.
John and his discussion of what this legislation would do would mean that I would benefit, given my income is low, that I would benefit from my Medicare premium, which I looked up this morning, and last year I paid what looked like about $110 for my premium. It's now up to $134. So my Medicare bill went from $110 to $134, and my great Social Security income just went to pay.
Also at the meeting was State Representative Connolly and State Senator Jalen, who both spoke about their support for the bill and Massachusetts Senior Action Council.
So many parts of what I heard today are why my senior action is important. One is getting you connected to help you in your individual situation. The other is to take all these individual situations and understand what the solutions might be, because you can't fix them by yourself. And then the last is to take all of your individual voices and give you a chance to make those voices heard and to give you a microphone so we can hear you.
Organizers said they felt the meeting went well and that they plan to continue to lobby until the bill is passed.
I think the meeting went really well. There were a lot of people who I had only met once or twice or didn't know who came here from Somerville who seemed to really be moved by this campaign, and a lot of people who got to share their experiences for the first time. That was really, for me, like exciting and moving to watch them.
In the first part of the meeting, I explained that we're supporting a health care bill that we believe will benefit tens of thousands of lower income seniors who are now struggling to make their budget, basically, and do not qualify for Mass Health and the other programs designed to benefit the poorest of the seniors. And we've been working at it for a long time, and we've just reached the point where we think that there's a real chance to pass it this year.
So moving forward, we're going to continue to be working on this bill. Hopefully it will be passed this session by July, but that's going to take a lot of lobbying on our part and a lot of, we want to make sure that the legislators know that this is an issue across the state in every district.
For more information or to get involved, go to massseniораction.org. For Somerville Neighborhood News, this is Caitlin Badian.
Welcome back. Our guest this month on Beyond Boston is Lynne Doncaster, author of the Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism story, Still Standing. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So this is like a community news story at its finest, and in many ways, a generation in the making. So can you just kind of, just tell us what it came out of?
Sure. I grew up in Davis Square. The statues that are in the plaza were unveiled when I was just about 6 years old. This was the first art that was happening in Somerville. And I was young, but I knew it was really exciting that we were suddenly getting art, because before there had just been a giant hole in the ground where I was told there would be a subway station. Suddenly there were these statues. About a year after they were installed, someone spray painted them. I was very upset about it. So I took my 6-year-old initiative and wrote to the mayor, who wrote back to me and promised that the statues would be cleaned up. And since then, I've been really interested in them and looking out for them, making sure that they're preserved.
Now, we now know, because the article, Still Standing, of course, about the statues still standing, It really is extremely popular. We now know that people care. How much did you know that other people cared? How much have you discussed this, not just with other Somerville natives, but just people in general, whether they're passing through, theater goers, or people who've moved there recently?
Well, I see people around the statues all the time. I hear people say that it must be Mr. and Mrs. Davis, which they are not. I see people take selfies with them. I see people let their kids climb on them. I see ice cream on them. I see various degrees of vandalism happening. So I know people are paying attention to the statues. Knowing that people didn't know who they were but were making up their own histories made me want to tell the story of who they really are and why they were there.
Now there's no plaques, right? Or is there anything at all? I mean, you must see other people poking around looking for something?
No, there's no indication of who the models were. Part of that was because the intent of the project was just to show people on the plaza, just that anyone could use this space. So the different characters that they have, there's a street performer, there's people who owned a business, there's a family, to show that anyone could be here.
I really love the point in the story about how, since at the time it wasn't an area that was used to art, instead of saying, hey, let's put in famous figures or anything like that, let's do something that's relatable. And that it was relatable, that it stuck and people dug it, especially people like you.
Well, I mean, it was relatable, but also that this was the mid-'80s. Somerville was a very working class neighborhood. So the concern was that something that was abstract or more modern wouldn't be understood by the locals. Which is something that's interesting for me because I was one of the locals. I ended up going to art school and studying modern art, and the assumption that I or my family wouldn't be able to understand something that wasn't figural, it goes back to a lot of the issues that I've had growing up in Somerville and what was expected of us.
And they weren't even made to stand. That still standing is kind of like a double entendre here. They're not made of, if you were gonna make a statue to last a lifetime, that's not what they were thinking.
Right, if you want a statue to last a lifetime, you want to use metal.
Right.
These are made out of cast concrete, something called ciment fondu. The sculptor was one of the pioneers of using this. So it's cast concrete and then sculpted on top. So they are strong. They will last a very long time, but they were not intended to last forever. The original call was for something that would last 100 years. The sculptor actually thought maybe he'd be happy if they just lasted 20.
This is the perfect kind of story that's just right there in front of you, and that's where the interest comes from. It's something that people see almost every day. And hey, I've never lived near Somerville, but I've spent a lot of time there. It's just a place that means a lot to a lot of people, especially Davis Square, the heart of it all. Do you have an eye for these kinds of stories? I know we're talking about a couple others, and also just that history. As somebody who's from Somerville, do you feel like it's appreciated, kind of telling those stories, and that's something that really people want to see. They want to know about. The background.
Oh, I think so. I've cared about these statues for a long time, and I recently posted, before I wrote this article, I posted something on Facebook when someone had stuck a sticker on one of them. And one of my friends said, learn about the places you're gentrifying. And that's what I'm trying to do with articles like that and some other stuff that I want to talk about, is I want people who are coming here to understand that there were people who were here who had their own neighborhoods, and that Somerville may have become more popular with new people arriving, but it didn't become Somerville. There was a place before the hipsters.
Now, for those who aren't familiar, we're going to obviously show some of the some footage of what the statues look like. Can you just explain the masks? People really want to know.
Yeah.
The masks. Why do the figures look the way they do?
When the statues were first made, they were entirely cast concrete, and if you look at old sculptures, you'll see a lot of times they're missing noses, the faces are messed up because those are really small pieces of concrete and it's easy for those to get broken. There were concerns about vandalism, and Somerville did have a reputation for vandalism. After the statues had been damaged, the sculptor went back to the original molds and was able to cast the faces in bronze. So the faces that are on the statues now are later additions, and it does sort of have the effect of making them look like they're wearing masks. And there are mixed feelings about that.
So as well, just to sum it up, like even for someone like you, grew up looking at them, has written letters your whole life, and written notes on Facebook regarding them, What was what really blew your mind? What did you have no idea about?
For me, coming to the understanding that they were never meant to be permanent. It made me question why I've been so interested in preserving them. Is it just about these statues, or is it about preserving a history and a story and a collection of stories about how a city has evolved?
Well, I don't want to be too hyperbolic about things, but I think that just the popularity of the story in general can speak to them standing for a little bit longer, at the very least. What do you think?
Well, I hope so, and I'm really glad people have been interested in the story.
Cool. Well, still standing. Check it out on DigBoston or Boston Institute for Nonprofit Journalism site. Lynn, thanks a lot for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Hello, my name is Bettina.
And my name is Sam. And we are undergraduate students at MIT.
We want to tell you a bit about what we have learned this week about climate change in the area.
Massachusetts is a diverse, mountainous region, home to 6.8 million people and 427 endangered species. Massachusetts is a special place. It is my home, has been my home, and has been facing the impacts of climate change over the past few decades. The world is warming due to emissions of multiple gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and water vapor in the atmosphere. Some people know these as greenhouse gases or blanket gases because they trap in heat like a blanket.
Climate change has been linked to events such as rising sea levels, more intense storms, and droughts. As you've probably seen in recent years, the weather can fluctuate more than you'd expect in a given season. Even in the past 4 years, we've witnessed some of these unexpected variations in weather. A prime example is the difference we saw between the winter of 2015 and the winter of 2016. In 2015, we saw record-breaking snowfall, while in February 2016, we had an average temperature of around 54 degrees Fahrenheit.
In order to tackle this issue, this spring break, we follow the U.S. Coast Guard, people who go out onto the water every day and watch the effects of climate change. Officers at the Navy War College, soldiers who have an increased difficulty in providing humanitarian aid to countries with more intense storms, and MIT, a coastal school trying to protect its students from a rising tide and increased flood risks. They showed us the erosion slowly washing away our islands in the Boston Harbor, the ocean slowly climbing closer.
We learned about the preventative measures these groups were using to cope with climate change, but without communal action, they won't be able to make much progress. We've seen more and more high-intensity storms and changing wildlife populations, but together we can make a difference through unified action.
Finally, last but never least, we have BINJ Network Director Jason Pramas on public education in Mass, the critical community story that never stops giving or aggravating.
There was an interesting conversation recently between two people that I often criticize for being insufficiently public-spirited. The Boston Globe's Shirley Long asked Boston Mayor Marty Walsh a great question. What if the city took over UMass Boston? Walsh, to his credit, replied, "Am I looking to take on a potentially new school? No. Do I think Boston potentially could be positioned well enough to handle it? Absolutely." UMass Boston has been struggling to make ends meet for over a decade. According to the Dorchester Reporter, union activists at the school say that student tuition and fees are actually sufficient to cover its operating costs. But UMB labors under over $30 million in structural deficit from the cost of belatedly rebuilding a campus that was thrown together with substandard materials by corrupt contractors on top of a landfill back in the 1970s, and a lot of other debt besides. Successive legislatures and governors have been unwilling to fork over the money needed to cover the long-needed repairs, sticking a school with a quote-unquote urban mission to serve working-class Boston students with a mountain of debt that it can't clear on its own. Even after controversial longtime Chancellor J. Keith Motley was ousted last year and replaced with interim Chancellor and state government hatchet man Barry Mills, who presided over the layoff of dozens of critical faculty and staff in the interest of balancing the school budget, even though the UMB community is not to blame for its plight. As the state prepares to bring in a new permanent chancellor, it is not prepared to do the right thing. So it's definitely worth pushing Walsh to at least produce a serious study on whether a city that struggles to properly fund K-12 education could really do a better job running a medium-sized research university than the Commonwealth can. It remains to be seen if UMass Boston is too heavy a fiscal burden for the city of Boston to take on. But there is a way that Mayor Walsh could dip his toe into the murky waters of administering a four-year public college without taking over UMB in its entirety. That would be to consider a plan for a separate city university that I had a hand in developing between 2005 and 2007 when I was a student and then a graduate teaching assistant at UMB's College of Public and Community Service, better known as CPCS, which was originally conceived as a possible response to the university's destruction of that innovative and popular division. CPCS was the most diverse college within the most diverse university in the entire Northeast. Not only did it focus on recruiting working-class Boston students from non-traditional backgrounds like single mothers, it also put a lot of effort into recruiting older working students like me that had never finished college. It was founded in 1972 and 1973 by professors and politicians that believed so strongly in UMB's urban mission that they developed a college purpose-built to take students from poor city neighborhoods with few opportunities and turn them into stellar university graduates, which it did with aplomb for over 40 years. Unfortunately, the administration of a decade ago, led by a then recently hired Motley, decided that the few bucks more it cost per year to educate a CPCS student compared to a regular UMB student was too much to spend. So it killed the college in all but name by 2008, despite strong protests by its students, staff, and faculty. Given the current crisis at UMass Boston, it seems to me that Mayor Walsh could revive the plan for a new City University of Boston that myself and other campus activists first suggested as a successor to CPCS. The goal would be to provide a place for a few hundred working-class native Bostonians at a time, students who can handle a four-year degree program academically but are being driven out of UMB by its ever-rising sticker price and its shift to attempting to compete with local private universities for white suburban middle-class students and full freight-paying foreign students by building dorms, which is being done in part to allow its latest cowardly administration to get rid of its debt load without direct state aid. If the new college does decently well for a few years, then maybe the city could take over UMass Boston in its entirety, merge the two, and move on to strengthen its urban mission university-wide, returning the school to its urban-focused roots, with local sources of funding that are somewhat more receptive to community needs than state funding sources, and a new sense of purpose. Ultimately, Massachusetts will still have to properly fund public higher education statewide, but that's a discussion for another day. For Beyond Boston, I'm Jason Pramas.